Phil Davis is a Bellator and UFC veteran who also had a successful amateur folk-style wrestling career for the Penn State Nittany Lions. There he amassed an overall record of 116 wins with only 20 losses, which took him to a 2008 NCAA championship and also made him a 4-time Division I NCAA All-American wrestler. He then transitioned into mixed martial arts, adding a striking game to his repertoire, where he had a successful run in the UFC before moving to Bellator and capturing their light heavyweight championship. In this study, we'll be breaking down how Phil Davis took his base in folk-style wrestling and adapted it to mixed martial arts. In particular, we'll be looking at his mat wrestling tactics, where he was known for superior top control and dominating pressure. We'll focus in on particular techniques such as his use of the ankle ride, as well as inside wrist control, cross wrist control, cradles, mat returns to help bring the opponent back to the mat, and arm chops. Let's start with his use of the ankle ride or Iowa ride. This is where from top position, Phil Davis would hook underneath the opponent's shin with his inside leg. This gives him excellent control over the opponent's base as he is able to move and manipulate their leg and knee, which is especially useful to prevent them from standing and is also much less defended than if he were to throw a hook in for riding legs. We can see a technical entry here into the ankle ride where he uses the toes of his outside foot to help lift the shin of the opponent's leg and create the opening for his own leg to slide underneath. He could also enter into the ankle ride directly from a mat return or just from simply hooking with his inside leg to create the space. One caveat from this position is to be careful not to load the hips onto the opponent and become susceptible to a rolling knee bar. But from this riding position, Phil Davis was able to wear out his opponents with strikes with 3 main ones available. The first is the hook in front of the opponent's arm, followed by the hammer fist to the far side of the opponent's head, and the third being the uppercut delivered underneath the arm of the opponent. And by cycling through the uppercut, the hammer fist, and the hook from this position, Phil Davis was able to find openings in the opponent's defenses as they were unable to defend all those targets at once. To help secure this position, Phil Davis would also use wrist rides on his opponents to control one of their wrists while leaving his other hand free. One of these techniques was inside wrist control, where he grabs the opponent's wrist from behind their own arm, which he is then able to manipulate while throwing punches with his free arm. He would secure inside wrist control from the ankle ride, but also, as we see here, from a single leg ride, or side back control, or even when his opponents began to post up in half guard. As the opponents attempt to use their hands as a post to get back to their feet, the inside wrist control allowed Phil Davis to drive his weight forward and collapse the post, making it difficult for his opponents to stand. Especially as while this is happening, they are being continually punched, may also have a leg being controlled, or are generally preoccupied with trying to free their wrist and make some kind of positional improvement. We can see another option being utilised by Phil Davis here, as he had inside wrist control with his left arm, but reaches across with his right arm to grab the wrist of his opponent. This cross wrist control is another technique that Phil Davis used from folk-style wrestling, where he would normally set it up from a crossface to secure the far wrist where it can be used to drive and break down the opponent's base. In MMA, this is an excellent control to punch from, although it's more preferable to have control of the near arm while reaching over the opponent's back to grab their wrist, allowing you to punch with the other hand. Although with the cage blocking the opponent's back, you can see Phil here switching hands to free up his right hand for punching. And similar to inside wrist control, Phil Davis would use it from the ankle ride, or as you can see here, from a single leg ride, or any side back position. And where this wrist ride strategy would really be effective is, as we see here, he would switch back and forth between inside wrist control and cross wrist control to constantly attack the opponent's posts while wearing them out with riding and punches. The cross wrist is essentially a hand trap on the opponent, where if they rolled onto their backs, they'd find themselves in a modified gift wrap where they'd only have one hand free to defend themselves. And another use of the cross wrist is again combining it with the inside wrist control to wrist ride the opponent back into the mat by breaking their posture and making it difficult for them to get to their feet. Preventing the opponent from getting back to their feet and escaping is another important part of top control in folk style wrestling, and this is where mat returns come into play. Mat returns are any lift or trip that's performed from in top control as the opponent looks to stand to get back to their feet that brings them back to the mat, usually on all fours or flat. If they manage to stand, Phil Davis would lock his hands around the waist of the opponent and drive their weight forward, normally stepping his hips around to the side so he could block one of their legs with his own. By bringing all of his weight forward towards the head of the opponent, it would break their posture and force them to put their hands back on the mat to post. You can see here he would also maintain inside wrist control as his opponent stood to help assist with the mat returns, and here he'd maintain cross wrist control also to help with the mat return. So by driving the opponent's weight forward along with blocking a leg, combined with maintaining wrist control and ground strikes as the opponent stood up and after they were returned to the mat return strategy caused the opponents to exert a lot of energy for no positional gain. Because it's one thing knowing how to take an opponent down, but it may even be more important knowing how to keep them there. Another excellent means of control from folk style wrestling is the use of cradles, where Phil Davis would trap the head and leg of the opponent and look to score back points or pins. In mixed martial arts, this offered excellent control of the opponent's body, preventing them from standing and making them expend energy as they struggled to escape. You can see here Davis capturing the left leg and head of his opponent as he then turns and brings them back down to the mat. He then further modified the position for mixed martial arts by retaining the cradle and throwing knees to the body of the grounded opponent as they were still trapped and struggling to escape. The use of knees to the body of a grounded opponent or an opponent on all fours was a good tactic that Phil Davis made use of to modify his riding style for mixed martial arts. You can see him throwing knees to the body while in the ankle ride, but also here, just while riding in side back, he'll punch the body before standing up completely to throw further knees. Combining these knees to the body with his mat return strategy made the process of trying to get back to their feet very difficult for his opponents. And another fundamental folk style wrestling move he would use to bring an opponent back to the mat is the arm chop. This is where he would chop his hand down towards the elbow joint of his opponents, rotating it towards their body and collapsing their post, sending them back to the mat. He could then combine the arm chop with other mat return strategies, preventing the opponent from posting on their hands and building a base to stand. Phil Davis is an excellent practitioner of utilizing his folk style wrestling base and adapting it for mixed martial arts fighting. Many people mistakenly assume that wrestling is simply the art of taking an opponent down, but folk style wrestling puts heavy emphasis on top control and riding techniques that concern themselves with keeping an opponent down after you've scored the takedown. These mat wrestling techniques are excellent for wearing an opponent out and put the focus on securing dominant position when on the mats. And while there are no submissions in folk style wrestling, it did actually evolve from catch as catch can, or catch wrestling, where they are a feature, and many positions and holds still remain that can cause a lot of pain and discomfort for the opponent. Some of these positions Phil Davis was able to put on his opponents in MMA. Folk style wrestling also places a lot of emphasis on control from the front headlock position, which Phil Davis was then able to utilize by combining it with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and a traditional submission wrestling game to incorporate chokes. Also, the search for inside wrist control always opened up a lot of double wrist locking options, but Phil Davis was able to utilize a move straight from folk style wrestling to score a submission when he won via hammerlock. Phil Davis was able to combine these styles together to mix his submission threats along with his unique grapple boxing tactics with mat returns, riding, and dominant top control to wear his opponents out and pressure them to make mistakes. And just like in folk style wrestling, he made sure his opponents would have to earn the right to get back on their feet. Part of this involved scrambling to make sure any dynamic movement the opponent made was quickly curtailed and dominant position was re-established, making them carry a weight and keeping them on the mat. And from there, the constant riding and punching is such an effective strategy to wear an opponent out before seeking to put hooks in and possibly take the back for a choke. And by combining this riding time along with takedown skills and mixing in a striking game, folk style wrestling has proven itself to be possibly the most effective style of wrestling to transition into mixed martial arts. And that concludes this breakdown of Phil Davis and his use of folk style wrestling in MMA. I hope you enjoyed this study. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and like and share the video as it really helps me out. Also, comment down below what style of wrestling you think's best adaptable for mixed martial arts. And follow me on Twitter @SonnyBrown. Thank you.